This is going to be a little bit different than what I did the other night. This is the other half of demolishing Islam. And I don't apologize for saying that. I have said it for years that I think we really need to see Islam stopped in our lifetime. Not Muslims, but Islam. Now, let me make a distinction. And for those that whenever these videos get put up on ELF, on their focal site, the Muslims grab them and they pull them down. And then they unpack everything I've said, and then they take me on, and it's great fun. So I know this is all going to be, you Muslims, you're going to take all of this stuff and you're going to pull it down. And this is one way to engage. In some ways, it's a good way also to be peer-reviewed. This is a way of being peer-reviewed. I know that hundreds of Muslims are going to see what I'm going to say today, and they're going to put up videos. I'm going to have to then respond to them. And that's how we learn, and that's how we actually increase. And so it's great fun, this kind of interaction. Let me give you a background as to why and who I am, so you understand why I'm saying what I'm saying, because it may disturb you, especially being European, this kind of talk. I grew up in India, was born in India. My parents were Mish kids, were missionaries. My grandparents were missionaries, so I'm third generation Mish kid from India. My grandparents went to India in 1913, and my family's still there. My sister and her husband live there, and they're not going to leave. My parents' graves are there. My grandfather's grave is there. They never left India. They loved it so much, and dedicated their whole life. And to understand why Islam, all of North India is mostly Muslim, and we are now the second largest Muslim country on earth. India is. We have surpassed Pakistan as the second largest. According to the latest statistics, we will soon surpass Indonesia as the largest Muslim country on earth in about another 15 to 20 years with the demographic growth that we have in India. So having grown up in northern India and having had Muslim roommates, I've grown up with Muslims in my school. I did all my first 12 years in India, and then I left India. And I remember when I left, I was so glad to leave India and so glad to leave all the Muslims, because they were very aggressive. Any discussion we had, it was always the Muslims against me. And so I've grown up my whole life debating. That's why I have no fear of Muslims. I love them. They're the most engaging people, but I didn't at that time in 1971. And I was so glad to finally leave and go to a place called America. Now, my accent is American, right? But this I didn't get in America. I got this in India at a missionary school called Woodstock up in the mountains. So when I talk to Indians, I talk like this. They say, "What are you doing? White man talking like this." But I can't help it, you know. We talk like this all the time. This is the way we talk whenever we're in that environment. Moving into the American accent, I have to use that in the West. And it's that background that prepared me for what I'm doing now. I didn't plan to go back to the Muslim world. I married a Mish kid like myself from Kenya, Judy. Here's her picture here, my wife. And she grew up in Kenya. I grew up in India. We met in America in undergraduate studies. But after we got married, I was doing postgraduate studies at that time, and I went to a seminar, a one-day seminar, something like what we're doing today, on Islam. And we were told back, this is 1981 now, so we were told back in 1981 that there were 800 million Muslims. Huge number. How do you compute a number like that? Too big. But then we were told that there were only 1,500 missionaries working amongst them. Now that number I could compute. That was a small number, and we were told that 1,500 only made up 2% of all missionaries. So worldwide, we were sending only 2% to the fastest growing religion on earth. And those two numbers were like a slap in the face. And I turned to my wife and I said, "What in the world are we doing wrong? Why is it we're only sending 2% to the one religion that's attacking us at our foundation, the one religion that is growing faster than any other, the one religion that is taking over the world?" Now that back then in 1981, it was still pretty much in the Muslim world. There weren't that many Muslims in the West yet. And so we went to our mission board and we said, "Listen, send us to the Muslim world." And they had no work with Muslims, which was symptomatic of the very problem. So we were seconded, that means we were lent out to SIM, which used to be called Sudan Interior Missions. Now they call it Society of International Ministries. And they sent us to Senegal, West Africa. By this time, I had a master's degree in Islamics from Fuller Seminary under Dr. Dudley Woodbury. So I thought I knew everything I needed to know about Islam, having grown up with it, having had a master's degree in it. And I went to Senegal. And the reason why they sent us to Senegal is because no one else wanted to go there. Because you have to learn 2 languages to go to Senegal. You have to learn French, and then you have to learn Wolof. So we went to work amongst the Wolof people, and I immediately realized that my training did not prepare me for this kind of Islam, because this was very much of a Sufi Islam. It's the confreries, the brotherhoods, the Qadriniya, the Tijaniya, the Murids, especially the Murids, which was an indigenous group of Muslims. And every one of these brotherhoods had pirs or marabouts. Marabouts would be like sheikhs. They would be authorities, but they became mediators between God and man. They took on the role of mediation. Now that I had never really studied. That doesn't exist in Orthodox Islam at all. In fact, it's anathema in Orthodox Islam. And most of these confreries, these Tijaniyas, these Qadraniyas had come out of Iraq and had filtered down through West Africa. And remember, in West Africa, we've had Islam there since the 11th century. So it's a very old form of Islam. While we were there, and we had get dedicated to get 5 years there, and we started a church in Wolof there in our front room, and we were the first Wolof church in Senegal. It has now daughtered 2 or 3 other churches. But after 5 years, we got a warning, or not a warning, but a call from our missions office saying there's a real problem in London. Now, I looked on the map, and London did not look like it was in the 1040 window, in that window that you think of the majority of Muslim populations, the 10th and 40th parallel. London was outside of that window, and I couldn't figure out why there were this large group of what they call radical Muslims. And they didn't know how to deal with them, and they didn't know, none of the missionaries had ever come across this kind of Islam. Well, I suddenly perked up and said, hold on a minute, radical Islam, those are my people. They're the ones I love. They're the ones I work with. That's what I'd grown up with. Do you understand what I mean by radical Islam? Well, what's the word radical mean? Give me a definition of radical. A radical number is what?
Root.
Root, there you go. So let's use that definition. Radical Islam would be the root of Islam. To be a radical Islam means to go back to the root. So what would be the root of Islam? There you go. And the model for this book? Okay, so the Book of the Man. The Book of the Man would be the root of Islam. And this was created by a man named Ibn Taymiyyah in the 1300s. And he was the one that actually defined real Islam. He said to be a good Muslim, you must read the Quran and you must follow Muhammad. The Book of the Man, the Book of the Man. 1300. Remember in the 1500s, 200 years later, a man in Germany said much the same thing about Christianity. His name was Martin Luther. Nailed up those 95 theses on the Wittenberg door. Remember that? What did he say? To be a good Christian, we must sola scriptura. We must only come back to Scripture, which is modeled on Jesus Christ. And we call that our Reformation. And I've heard so many people say, when is Islam going to be reformed? And I said, folks, it got reformed before we got reformed. They beat us by 200 years. Ibn Taymiyyah is the foundation for Islam worldwide. All your radical Muslims go back and they quote him. The reason why is because there were 2 men in the 1700s, one named Ibn al-Wahhab. Abdullah al-Wahhab. Al-Wahhab was living in Medina, and he was studying in Medina, 1700. So you're talking about, 400 years later. With him was another man named Wahiullah, who had come from Bihar in India, Eastern India, where my grandparents worked. Now, they weren't living in 1700, obviously, but back in 1700, these 2 men were studying Ibn Taymiyyah's material, so they were inculcating this whole paradigm of going back to a book modeled by a man. To be a good Muslim, that's the definition. Al-Wahhab he remained there in Arabia. He then amalgamated himself with a family called the Ibn Saud family. The Ibn Saud family then eradicated all their enemies and took over the entire peninsula. But they were nothing more than a political control. They needed a religious authenticity, and that's why they brought in Al-Wahhab, because he gave them the legitimacy of theology. And that's where Wahhabism started. So Wahhabism is based on Ibn Wahhab. That's where the name comes from. 1700, look at your dates. That's 400 years ago. Meanwhile, Wahihula went back to India. And he, back in India, he's the one that started the madrasas all over East India. When the British came to India, his disciples were so strong that the British had to contend with them. And what the British did is they just moved them right across over North India over into the mountains. And so they fled up into the mountains, the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas, where they still are today. And that's why places like Waziristan, where the Pashtuns are, all this northwest frontier, that was all became strongly radicalized Muslim, all based on Wahihula's teaching that was based on Ibn Taymiyyah's teaching. So this has been around for a good 700 years. This is not new. Now, let's jump to the 20th century. In the 20th century, then you had, there in India, you have two names that you need to know of. One is Maududi, who lived in northern India. In fact, he lived very close to where I grew up before me. And in the 1920s and up into the 1940s, he was in the city of Deoband, which is between Delhi and where I lived, up in Mussoorie, up in the mountains. I remember whenever I'd go back to visit my parents from boarding school, the train would stop there in Deoband, and there'd be these huge madrasas on either side of the railway tracks. Now, being a young kid, I didn't really see the significance of these huge madrasas. I've now learned more about them now that I've left. But it was fascinating because he then in 1947, when India got its independence, he then moved from India and moved over to Pakistan and started the Jamaat-e-Islami. And the Jamaat-e-Islami then took over many of those madrasas in the northwestern frontier. And they created huge schools of training, all training and teaching Ibn Taymiyyah's material. Go back to the Quran, modeled by the Prophet Muhammad. Their students were talibés. Talibé means student in Arabic and in Urdu. The Talibé became the Taliban. The Taliban then moved into Afghanistan, because that's all Pashtun, they're all the same tribe. Moved into Pakistan and threw out the Russians. That's probably where you all came into the picture. That's where many of you then were living, and you know what happened once they threw out the Russians. Meanwhile, in Delhi, even before that, in 1920s, a man named Muhammad Ilyas. Muhammad Ilyas was another very radical Muslim who had been brought up on Ibn Taymiyyah's material. He had been heard about all that Wahihula. But we're now in 1920s, he started another group called the Tablighi Jamaat in Delhi, capital of India. And remember, at that time, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh were all one country, created by the British. So that was a huge block of Muslims right there in one country. In 1947, then it became three countries: West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan, or the other way around for you: West Pakistan, India, and East Pakistan. So here you have the Tablighi Jamaat growing in India. You have the Jamaat-e-Islami growing there in Pakistan. That's what's happening in the Indian subcontinent. Now, this group, the Tablighi Jamaat, has grown and grown and grown since 1920s, 1924, so almost 100 years. It now is in 120 countries, and it has a membership of 80 million. Let me repeat that number, 80 million. That's a big number, isn't it? That's the population of Britain right there. Those are the Muslims I have been having to contend with in Britain. Most of the radical Muslims I'm engaging with are the Tablighi Jamaat. It was the Tablighi Jamaat that came and blew themselves up and killed 52 people in July 7th, 2005 in London. Do you all remember that? That is the Tablighi Jamaat. Most of the attacks that we've been getting in London and Manchester, we're just celebrating yesterday or today the bombing of Manchester. That was yesterday, I think. That was at the Tablighi Jamaat. So almost all the attacks that we're getting in Britain are infused by the teachings of the Tablighi Jamaat. These are the groups that none of you have heard about, and you never will hear about because you're not engaged in that level. Most of you have only think about Islam as being Arab. You're not thinking about the Indian subcontinent. The Indian subcontinent is by far much greater, much bigger than anything in the Arab world. And it's the Indian subcontinent where we're getting all of our attacks against Christianity. There is not one well-known Muslim Arab who is attacking Christianity. Name me one. Let me give you the names of all those who are attacking Christianity. Ahmed Deedat. Is he Arab? No. He lived in Durban in South Africa, but he's from India. Zakir Naik. Go up on YouTube, put his name there. Thousands of videos by him. He's from Bombay. Probably the most prolific today. Shabir Ali. No. Lives in Toronto, but he is from India. Adnan Rashid from Pakistan. Mansur Ahmad from Bangladesh. Most all of the best known debaters today, polemicists who are attacking Christianity, are from the Indian subcontinent. And there's a reason why they're from the Indian subcontinent. Two reasons, really. One is because they were colonized by Britain, and being colonized by Britain, they have grown up with the English educational system. From middle school on up, everything is in English in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Unlike the rest of the Muslim world, where everything is either in Arabic or whatever the local language is, Indonesian or all the rest. But secondly, because Britain is a Christian power, they have already engendered and ingrained themselves on how to attack Christianity. And they saw quickly, much quicker than the Arabs world, that Christianity was Islam's greatest threat. And it stands to reason we're their greatest threat. Because we stand against everything they believe. We stand, if you look and see the two religions, when you look at them and you do a comparison between Islam and Christianity, Christianity in every major case stands against Islam. So can you see then why in the Indian subcontinent this has gone much quicker, much faster? And the other reason is, just look at the numbers. Just look at the numbers of Muslims in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. If you just add up their Muslim, not Hindu, not anything else, just Muslim population, you have over 650 million Muslims. Look at the numbers. There's nothing that is as big as that. Nowhere else in the world is as big as that. Indonesia only has 200 million. The whole Arab-speaking world, the entire Arab-speaking world, is only 270 million. 650 million just in one block. And yet we're not doing anything, hardly anything. No one wants to go to the Indian subcontinent. So that's why I've dedicated and done most of my work in the Indian subcontinent. That's why I have to work in this area. Because when you work with Indians and Pakistan and Bangladesh, you have to engage in the historical critique. The reason why is because they're using it. No Arab, I've never met an Arab that attacks me historically, or that even defends Islam historical. They don't even understand that there's a problem there. And the reason why, it's not that they're not intelligent enough, it's because Christianity is so small and so weak, it doesn't even appear on the radar. It's not a threat to them. There's no threat. Whenever I'm at Speaker's Corner, for 25 years, I would go every Sunday down to Speaker's Corner, and I'll be there this next Sunday, in a few days, and we would engage with whoever's in front of us, and almost invariably, if I'm talking to an Arab, I'm just going to go in a circle with them. They have never heard of the Trinity. They won't even know about the Christology of Jesus. About authority of Scripture, they don't even know that that's a problem. None of these things, they've never heard this. They have no idea that Jesus died on the cross or Isa died on the cross. These are things that they don't think about. They want to talk about George Bush. They want to talk about Trump. They want to talk about politics. They want to talk about Israel. They want to talk about anything but not theology, because they don't believe that there's a problem with theology. They don't even know that we have a difference in theology. So I don't engage at that level with them. Well, that's not quite true. I make sure we engage theologically, because I'm not there to talk politics. I don't care dilly swat about politics. That's not true. I do, but not when I'm engaging with Muslims. If I have a Turk standing in front of me, I have to tell them what they believe before I can even take them on, because they have no idea what they're to believe. If I have a North African, either somebody from Algeria, and we get quite a few from Morocco that come through, I have to quickly switch to French, and then we go at it. But they all want to talk about the French colonial system. They all want to talk about how terrible the colonial system is. They don't want to talk theology because they don't think theology is important. But when I get somebody from Indian subcontinent, anybody from Pakistan, India, or Bangladesh, I have to take a deep breath, because I know I'm in for a real battle. And they will have Bibles in their hands. They never have a Quran. They never bring a Quran. They only have Bibles. And they have little post-it notes all the way through with seeming errors or historical anachronisms or scientific problems. God bless them. Aren't they great? I'm so excited when I see a Muslim with a Bible in their hands, because then I know I'm home. I know that we're going to have a great discussion. And we usually go out to tea afterwards, and usually they pay for it. And this is the lovely thing about Muslims. They love, especially from the Indian subcontinent, they love to talk theology. And they love to talk about two things. What are the two things they like to talk about? What would you guess? The book and the man. They always want to take on this book. And they want to take on the man behind this book, Jesus Christ. To me, those are the two things I want to talk about. And I don't even have to dangle a carrot in front of their eyes. All I have to tell them is two things. And I always, whenever we get into, especially if I haven't seen them before, if they're the first time I've ever seen them, I always say, I believe Jesus is God. I believe the Bible is the Word of God. Do you have an opinion? And you might get 6 hours of opinion just on those two subjects, especially here in the West, especially here in Europe. Because they already have been trained up on how to confront those two areas. And that's why I encourage you, get to know some Muslims wherever you are. Find out where they are and just talk about Jesus and the Bible. Then you're going to have to talk about the Quran and Muhammad. At some point, that's going to come into your conversation because they will make claim after claim after claim. And this is now where we're going to get in today's talk. So that's the introduction, which took me, 15 minutes, sorry about that, to get into. How many have seen this lecture before? I've done this lecture once before, back in 2016. None of you? 1, 2. Well, you've seen everything I've done, so you don't count. In fact, I might have you come up here and do some of this. This is my other expert over here, so he's the other one, the other Islamicist in the room. What we're going to do then, I wasn't going to go through all introductory, but since none of you have seen this or don't where I'm going to go, we're going to do the whole introduction and go and walk you through it so that you know where we're going. Now, we are going to go till 10:30. Then we're going to have a half an hour break for coffee and try to peel yourself off the floor. And then we're going to come back at 11 o'clock and go till 12:15. Am I correct? 12:15. Under orders of my friend from Scottsdale. Because she wants to then give you, I guess, a handout after that. And we do need to get out of here and get our luggage so we don't get stranded here from getting our planes. So let's go ahead, and at any time, if you have any questions, just raise your hand because we have lots of time to get through this. We're in no hurry, and I really do want to engage. And I want you to come back at me. Try as best you can, especially, you put on your Muslim cap today, all right? Try to be a Muslim and try to listen to this from a Muslim perspective and try to hammer me any way you can, because the more I can get hammered now, the better it's going to be for that film. But also, it's better for the Muslims to see that we are able to engage like this as Christians. Let me define terms. I am a polemicist. My PhD is in polemics. In fact, I think I'm the first in the world to get a PhD in Islamic polemics for one very good reason. Most people don't even know what the word means. Secondly, there's no school in the world that teaches it. This doesn't exist. Am I correct? There's just no school that would dare teach this because they would be targeted by Muslims. Polemics, do you all know is there someone who doesn't know what that word means? You all know what it means? Yeah? Great, so we can go right ahead. So I go on the offense. That's what I am. I'm very offensive. And I don't apologize for being offensive because this is exactly what I'm called to do. Don't you do this in the Arab-speaking world, in Pakistan. You can do this in India, but not in Bangladesh. All right? You can do it in Indonesia. I have used this in Indonesia. I got stopped at the airport when they saw who I was, and they wanted to look at my computer, but I better be careful what I say. So this is all going on film. I won't tell you what I did. But we got in and we were able to so I can teach it in these countries. Be careful about using it in Muslim countries. That's all I would say. And it's sad that I have to say that. Isn't it interesting? We don't do this with the Christian world. No, there's no Christian or any organization that would censor anybody criticizing the Bible or criticizing the emergence of Christianity or criticizing Jesus Christ. This just doesn't exist. It did historically. We did have a historical period where that did happen, but not today. And certainly not in the New Testament period. And that's why it's fascinating that we're now coming full circle. We're doing what Paul did. And what I'm doing today is what Paul did when he was in Ephesus or Berea, Cappadocia, Laodicea, whenever he went into the synagogue and confronted the Jews with what they had done to the Messiah. That's what I do. I follow. He's my example and he's my paradigm. So what we're going to do today, be aware of the fact that this is more for Europe. This is for your locale. This kind of material you can use all over Europe. And really all over the world just not in the 1040 window. And I'm even saying that, be careful, because there are many places you can use it in the 1040 window. I'll let each one of you decide in your own, wherever you're going to move, or whatever country you're in, how it is effective or not. So let's start with this claim that Muslims make. So what do they claim? Well, they make the claim, and for the last 1,400 years they've made this claim. Now, I am going to tell you, put your pencils down. You're not going to keep up with me. However, all of you can have this PowerPoint. At the end of the session, just give me your USB drive and I'll slip it over to you, and you can put it on your computers. So this is available to all of you, not to those on the camera. I get this all the time. People all over the world, you said we could have this PowerPoint, because I said it on camera. For people only in this room, you can have this PowerPoint, all right? Because I do not want to spend my whole life sending PowerPoints all over the world. And remember, even what I say today, in another 6 months, it'll have changed, because we're getting in so much new material all the time. That's the exciting thing about this material. It is new, and it is exciting, and it's all going one direction, which is really helping us out. So let's go ahead and start with this claim. Whether Muslims are radicals, whether they are nominal, whether they are liberal, they would all make, well, maybe not the liberals. Let's hold off on the liberals. They may not make this claim, but anybody else would say that Muhammad is the last and the greatest of all prophets. They would say that the Quran was his revelation sent down only to him, and that it is the final and greatest revelation. So it supersedes anything that comes after it, even before it. And therefore, Islam is the final religion based on Muhammad's life and sayings and the Quran's teaching. So that's the book and the man. The teachings of Muhammad would be the Sunnah, and that would include the Sirah, which is the Siratul Rasulullah, his biography, the Hadith, which would be his sayings, the Tafsir, which would be the commentaries on the Quran, and the Tahriq, which would be the history. So those are the four genres of the Islamic, or the Sunnah of the Prophet, looking at his example to then apply what's in the Quran. So Islam is completely dependent on one book and one man, the book and the man. So we need to investigate both the Quran and Muhammad and see if indeed the Muslims are correct. We've already done the book 2 nights ago, and that, by the way, is up online. That what I did 2 nights ago is already up online on Fander Films. If you want to take a card, here's the thing on YouTube, Fander Films. Go up and look at it. I put it up about a month and a half ago. It was a talk that I did on the Quran in Hong Kong back in November, where I was to debate a Muslim, and he never showed up. So what I did, we decided to go ahead and put it and do it at the university there, the City University. The day before we were to do that talk at the City University, the Muslims in Hong Kong went to the authorities and said that I was a hate preacher and that I was an Islamophobe. Now, the City University didn't even ask to talk to me about it. They just banned me from the university, just like that. This is the 2nd year running where that has happened. The year before, in 2017, I was also in Hong Kong to go to another university to talk a similar talk, and we had already started the talk like we're doing right now. We were halfway an hour into the talk when the authorities came and threw us all out, 200 of us. And we all had to walk down the hill to a church and continue it. But you know, you can ban us all you want. We still film everything we say. And that went up on my Fander Film site about a month and a half ago. Over 40,000 people have watched it now. And we're getting reports, and Muslims are now contacting me who have become Christians because of that talk. The same talk that you all heard, but you heard very encapsulated, very short form, that is now up. So you can get the one on the Quran on Fander Films. That's up there now. Now this here is the next step. This is going now to Muhammad himself. This is going to the emergence of Islam and to these claims. One book modeled by one man. So what about the man? Well, let's see what Muslims have said. And this is what I called, this is the classical account. This is the only account you're going to hear on university campuses. This is the one you've grown up with. This is the one that every Muslim knows. And it starts from the premise that Muhammad was born in 570 in Mecca. That he received, or he came upon an angel in the Hijrah cave. Now he would go up there and meditate according to the classical account. I'm going to keep saying the classical account, okay? You'll see why. According to the classical account, based on Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq. So anytime I say Ibn Hisham and Ibn Ishaq, hold on to that. You'll see why. In 610 then, when he was approached by this angel, well, he didn't know who it was, and the angel says, Akra, which means read or recite. And his response was, Ma'akra, I cannot recite. The angel squeezed him. This happened 3 times, and finally the angel let him go. He fled back to Mecca, went to his wife, Khadija, his only wife at that time, told her what had happened. And so she did a quick test by having him sit on either leg, asking him the question, and then disrobing, knowing that if it was an angel, the angel would not be in her presence while she was naked. And so when he still said, yes, this was what happened to me, she realized he was telling the truth, went to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, to have him listen to this story. Waraka ibn Nawfal, according to the traditions, was a Nestorian Christian. Isn't that interesting? So her cousin is the one that listens to the story, turns to Muhammad and says, truly, you are a prophet. This is a revelation coming to you. So it's a Nestorian Christian that gives Muhammad the authority as a prophet, one of the ironies of history. He then starts to receive these revelations, and he receives them from 610 to 622 there in Mecca. He then, while he's receiving these revelations, he then recites them. He does not write these down. His companions there in Mecca would memorize what he was saying. So if you look at the Quran and you just split it in half, now this goes from right to left because it follows the Arabic. That would be Medina, this would be Mecca. So it's these surahs at the latter half, the second half of the Quran. There are some Medinan material here, and there is some Meccan material here, but that's the Meccan. It's the second half of the Quran because they're the largest surahs. Sorry, the other way around. They're the smaller surahs. So these revelations were much more short-winded to begin with, and they got more and more long-winded as he moved to Medina. He moves to Medina in 622, but before he moves to Medina, and then 621, he is woken up in the middle of the night, and he's told to go up on the back of a winged horse, who flies him up to Jerusalem, and from Jerusalem he goes up to the 7 heavens, gets up to the 7th heaven, and meets Allah up there, who tells him to pray 50 times a day. Comes down to the 5th heaven, meets Moses. Moses said, how many times did I ask you to pray? He says, 50. He says, that's way too many. Go back up and see if you can get it down. So he bounces back and forth between the 7th and the 5th heaven, bringing the prayers down from 50, 45 down to 10, 5 prayers. Once he gets it to 5 prayers, Moses says, fine, now you can go back down to earth. That's where we get the 5 prayers from. It's called the Miraj, and that happens there in 621 while he's in Mecca. Interesting. So the 5 prayers all Muslims pray today come from Moses. And it's fascinating because you will not find 5 prayers in the Quran. You will only find 3. Ironic, isn't it? Nonetheless, this happens in 621. 622 then, he is invited by the Ansar there in Medina to come up and arbitrate between the Ansar and the Jews. The Banu Kainuka family, the Banu Nadir family, the Banu Qurayza. These are the 3 Jewish tribes that were very wealthy, and they were dominating the trade, and the Ansar were having difficulties with them, and that's why they used Muhammad as a neutral arbiter to come and do that arbitration. So he moves up in 622. It's known as the Hijrah. Hijrah means, as you know, it means exodus. So he has an exodus to Medina with around 80, some traditions say as many as 200 followers. So it was not very large. Not very many people at that time. 622 then, he starts receiving this part of the Quran, the first part, the Medinan material, much longer, much more violent. These are the problematic chapters, not these. 622 then, that begins, and then in between 622 and 633, then in 630, he then moves down to Mecca, takes over Mecca without firing a shot. So now he controls all of the central part of Arabia, called the Hijaz, and then in 632 he suddenly dies, which tends to happen to all of us. Now, at his death, the Quran had not yet been written down. It was still on pieces of bark, stones, and in the memory of his companions. Abu Bakr takes over control, and he rules for 2 years. And at that time, he then is the first to have the Quran written down. He takes a man named Zayd ibn Thabit, who is the secretary of Muhammad, gives him that responsibility. So there's the first recension, the first copy, the first codex of the Quran written in 632 to 634. Abu Bakr dies, normal death. Umar takes over, and he's the one that starts to expand the borders and starts moving right across North Africa, in your direction this way, and then goes this direction over towards the Sassanid area. The Sassanids, these are the Persians. Now, he then is killed in 646, and Uthman takes over. So he's the third caliph. Caliph would be like a king. So from 646 to 656, Uthman is in power, and then he takes that copy that was made by Zayd ibn Thabit, and that had been hidden under the bed of Hafsa, one of the wives of Muhammad. He takes that copy of hers and has Zayd ibn Thabit redo that Quran again, recopy it, and to do it in the Qurayshi dialect. That happens in around 652. And then from that one copy, they make 9 copies, send it to 9 different provinces, and then he is killed in 646, and the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, Ali, then takes over as the 4th caliph. And he only survives 5 years. In 651, then he is killed at the Battle of Siffin by Muawiyah. So here you have the 4 caliphs, you have Muhammad's life, and you have the 4 caliphs. And sorry, did I say 651? 661, because he takes over in 656 to 661. So that's the story, the classical account. Have any of you heard any different? Now, you may have heard many other things. I'm just giving you the bare skeleton, okay? Is there any reason to doubt that? Everything I've told you, where does it come from? I helped you out about 5 minutes ago. I gave the names of where this comes from. Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Al-Tabari. Have you heard these names before? If you were a Muslim, and those who are listening, you would know these names immediately. And you would know that this is the only source for everything I've just told you. There's no other source. What are these names? Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Al-Tabari.
From 9th century.
Good man. You do remember. Hey, give him a commendation. Take a look and see where this material. So everything we've talked about is right here in this period, right? There's the 570 to 632, and then on up to 650, around this area. So all this that we're talking about is where that red line is. Now, hopefully you would assume that everything that we're talking about was written by people who lived then, right? Should be, right? But they don't. The first time we hear anything about Muhammad's life is from Ibn Ishaq, right here. Look when he died, 765. But we don't have any of Ibn Ishaq's material. Everything we know about Muhammad, how Islam began, was actually written down by this guy right here, Ibn Hisham. Look when he died, 833. Muhammad died in 632. How many years? 200 years. So the first time we hear anything written down about Muhammad's life, anything we've written about how Islam began, about Medina, about Mecca, about this story about him going up to the 7 heavens, all these great stories is first written down 200 years after the fact. Ibn Hisham didn't even live in that part of the world. He lived far to the west and hundreds of years later and hundreds of miles away. He gets it from Ibn Ishaq, but as he says himself, much of what Ibn Ishaq said he did not trust, so he threw it out and only retained that which he trusts. So we have no idea whether or not even the material from Ibn Ishaq is in his writing. So therefore, everything we know about Muhammad begins to be written down in 833. What about the sayings of Muhammad, which are even more prolific? We're told by the Islamic scholars that a man named Al-Bukhari was given 600,000 of these sayings of Muhammad. They're called akhbars. And he took those 600,000 and then he whittled them down, threw out 98% of them, and only retained 7,397. So basically 7,400 of the 600,000. He only retained 2% of it and threw all the rest away. He dies in 870, so that's 240 years later that you get the first sayings of Muhammad written down in a codified form. We don't even have Al-Bukhari's original text. The earliest text we have for Al-Bukhari is not till the 11th century. When you get all 9 volumes, the 9 volumes of Al-Bukhari do not appear until the 17th century. Are you seeing what I'm saying? Now, the others that write down the hadith, men like Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, they all write after 870. So you're talking about 240 and later that you finally get these references to what Muhammad said. But these people don't even come from Arabia. Bukhari comes from Bukhara, which is up north of Iran today. Hundreds of miles away, hundreds of years later, they had never met Muhammad, yet they suddenly know what Muhammad said. So everything that we're dependent on, for our Muslims are dependent on for the classical account, comes from not 765, but from 833 and later. Now let's look at Christianity. Let's look at the biography of Jesus and look at the sayings of Jesus. The biography of Jesus would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the black letter part of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The sayings of Jesus, the hadith of Jesus, would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the red letter part. Wherever it's red letters. Some of you have red letters wherever Jesus speaks. That's the hadith of Jesus. The tafsir, I didn't talk about the tafsir. The tafsir of the commentaries don't begin to appear until 923. That's the 10th century. That's 300 years later. He is the first to write down any tafsir, and he's also the first, Al-Tabari is the first to write down any tahriq, which would be the histories of all mankind, 10th century. So everything we know about Jesus, what he said and did, was written, well, the first three Gospels were written within 40 years of Christ's death, by 60 AD, 70 AD, and then you have John, that would have been written about 90 AD. So within 60 years of Christ's death, you have the hadith of Jesus and the sirah of Jesus. Am I correct? 60 years. Written by those who actually knew him. John and Matthew were right there. They were with Jesus for the last 3 years. They saw what he did. They heard what he said. So they were eyewitnesses. The other two, Mark and Luke, got it from the eyewitnesses who were with Jesus. So here you have the tafsir and then the tafsir. The tafsir of Jesus would be the commentaries that explain what he did, would be Paul's letters. The gospel of Jesus applied in Philippi. The gospel of Jesus applied in Corinth, in Ephesus. These are the letters. So that's the commentary that would be equivalent to the tafsir of Muhammad. These would be the tafsir of Jesus. They were written within 15 to at least 65, because 62 when Paul was then finally killed in Rome. So all of them would have been written within 30 years of Christ's death. Am I correct on that? Though he was not an eyewitness to Jesus himself, he was the one that took and then applied it to each one of those cities. And the Tahriq would be the book of Acts. There's the equivalent, the book of Acts, which is this history of the early church. That would have been written by Luke. It had been written between 52 AD and 62 AD, within that 10-year period. So you understand that within 30 years you get the Tahriq. So all four genres are written within 50 to 60 years of Christ's death. All four genres for Muhammad would be written 200 to 300 years for Muhammad's death. Which is more authoritative? And yet no one's asked this question. I remember hearing this in 1994 when I was studying there at School of Oriental and African Studies under Dr. Gerald Hotting, and I heard these late dates, and I said, wait a minute. I raised my hands, and I said, this is hugely problematic. He says, yes, but we're not going to talk about that. Because there were 25 Muslims in the class. And he was the first one to introduce me what I'm going to be doing next, but it was fascinating that he did not want to come to any conclusions because he was fearful of what the Muslims would say. In London, the premier school in London on the history of Islam. So, 21st century scholars are deeply troubled by these late dates. And so they're saying this: Islam as we know it did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. The Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. Their conclusion is that the history of early Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik and before, is a later fabrication. Now, that's a huge bit to say. How am I going to prove it? I'm not going to prove it. I'm going to let them prove it. We're going to use their material. So, let's